Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first Border Observatory webinar for 2020. We are going to be talking today about Remain in Mexico. We're going to be giving an update, an immigration update from the borderlands, and we will begin shortly. We're just going to give a few more minutes for people to log in. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, welcome. We're having our first Border Observatory for 2020. It's an immigration update from the borderlands. It's going to be focusing on the 1 year, marking the 1 year of Remain in Mexico, also known as MPP, and providing a little bit more context as to what has been going on here on the border. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Edith Tapia. I'm the policy research analyst here at HOPE, and I'm joined by my colleague, Diego Adame, who's our creative producer, and he's the wonderful hands behind a lot of our designs, all of our designs. So he's going to be helping out today with the questions. So just to recap, what we're going to be covering today is going to be a situation report with 2020. We know that we're marking the 1 year since Remain in Mexico was implemented. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about what that is, but specifically from a borderlands. We're also using this as a way to launch our report that's going to be available. It's already available on our website, and we have links to it at the end of the report. But we'll be going through some of what we have there and taking some of your questions about that as well. We'll also focus on what we saw here in our community in terms of Mexican asylum seekers. And we're going to be sharing some of the findings from our Stanford report. We were fortunate to have a group from the Human Rights Clinic at Stanford come down during November, and their findings will be highlighted, and they're pretty important findings. So we're excited to be able to share that with everyone today. And we'll address a little bit about the response from the Red Pin report regarding Remain in Mexico. And we'll also talk a little bit more about the ICE and CBP budgets and apprehensions and do a side-by-side comparison. And then we're going to ask you to take some actions today and as we move forward. So, what is the status in the El Paso sector in Ciudad Juárez with regards to Remain in Mexico? We know that the program continues to, after 1 year, it continues to place migrants directly in harm's way in some of the most dangerous states in Mexico right now. We know that in terms of travel advisory from the US, all 5 of the northern states have high levels of risk for travel, yet we continue to send asylum seekers and migrants over knowing so. And even Tamaulipas, who shares level 4 of security risk alongside with Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. So that's a pretty stark comparison, when you're talking about upholding the rights for asylum seekers and protecting them, as the name claims to have, protections for migrants. We know that that is just not the case. So far, there are about 60,000 individuals who have been sent back to Mexico through this program at the national level. Less than 5 of them have legal representation. 20,000 or so have been sent back to Ciudad Juárez, our neighbor city. 25% of them are children, and it is actually less than the national average for legal representation. It is less than 3% of those individuals that have had access to any sort of attorney or someone who's going to represent them in court, which we know definitely helps their case, especially with all these changes that are occurring right now. And we also know that the Remain in Mexico program essentially is sending people, and they're stuck in a community that is essentially inadequate to protect them. They don't have shelter. As much as we have supported and praised the efforts for the community that has created all these shelter opportunities for migrants in Ciudad Juárez and across the borderlands, it's just not enough. There are not enough spaces, even with the federal shelter that Mexico opened in Ciudad Juárez, it is still not enough to house as many migrants that are there right now. We have seen that in the last few months, between the summer and December, there was actually quite a bit of a drop. And that, in fact, had to do with the long waits already, both from the metering list that is still in effect in Ciudad Juárez and across other borders, but also just, how many people were being sent back in the wait times for the cases that were being delayed, just ultimately created frustration. And the conditions in weather were not helpful. That we had many cold and rainy nights, and people that were either camping or just not having access to shelters were struggling with that. So we saw a little bit of a decline, but we know that that's there's no adequate access to enough shelter space. The same with healthcare and other work restrictions. Healthcare is a particular concerning situation where we know that migrants who are returned through the Remain in Mexico program will get access to the Social Security, essentially for Mexico, the state-run healthcare system for 3 months. Unfortunately, what we see is that most people, it's not enough time because they are remaining in Mexico, they're stuck in Mexico for longer than that period. And it's often not enough to get an appointment to be seen by a doctor. We've also seen discrimination within the healthcare system where migrants are not taken into the hospital or they're insulted or treated as less than, saying that Mexican citizens should be prioritized over migrants. So just, again, access to that has led to a lot of children, facing severe colds, pneumonia, other issues. And unfortunately, it has also led to deaths here in our community. In terms of work as well, even though some are able to access work permits, there's still discrimination that people are facing. There's still a lot of restrictions and concerns about when someone goes to work, what happens to their child. What happens to their child when they can't trust to be left alone in a house or in a shelter, where actually the shelter requires you to be with your child at all times. So how can this really be facilitated, an opportunity for someone to take a work position? And we find that most people end up finding work, those who are lucky, a lot of times more through the informal sector, and those who do end up signing up for some sort of work situation, it's usually in the maquiladora industry, and there's still a lot of issues there, and just in terms of accessing those situations and having to rely on public transportation and using the little bit of money that they're earning essentially just to be transported there. So we know we face those we see those as serious restrictions. And the next, or another layer that we have seen, obviously in our report, we highlight how problematic Remain in Mexico has been. We see that it's essentially an illegal practice, that it's preventing people from accessing their right to access asylum. And that is just one layer of deterrence that we have seen through this administration. It's just one element, one brick, if we will, of it. If we see this as the administration's own way of creating this wall as well, these barriers. Another situation that we saw here that just complicated the situation that was already quite fragile was the sudden arrival or the spike in arrivals of Mexican asylum seekers to our community. We know that Mexican asylum seekers have been coming for a long time, but the agglomeration and the numbers of it just created a little bit of a clash many times with, again, access to shelters. The fact that they were being metered or being told they were turned back. So ultimately what ended up happening was that many of them refusing to leave the ports of entry, trying to exercise their right to seek asylum, and even more so because they were in the territory that they were trying to escape. So, it sort of highlighted their priority. They were not being allowed to be processed immediately the way that they should be. And what this created were these long backlogs, and that led up to the creation of camps, essentially refugee camps, at the ports of entry. And that began in September 2019 and ended just in January of this year. As I mentioned earlier, the numbers started growing. They varied from port to port. We have 3 ports of entry here. All 3 ports of entry had encampments there. They varied in size, Most of them were self-organized, but what we saw is that most all of them were families, right? So the numbers would range between each port of entry, but we saw over 3,000 families who were just camping there for weeks and months on end. The numbers started to decline, again, as the conditions started to become more severe or more harsher weather conditions, many cold nights, and many of them, as the holidays started coming up, were just despaired and discouraged by the how slow the process was going. Were just frustrated as well. So many of them would just give up. We also know that a lot of them were in conditions that they did not have running water. They wouldn't have access to home cooked meals. A lot of it was just efforts by the community solidarity that would come and provide this. We saw school programs, volunteers coming by to establish schools for the kids there, but we knew that this wasn't enough, and they were facing a lot of hardship. They also faced a lot of dangers. Many of them were often harassed by not just the Mexican National Guard, the police, but also vulnerable to organized crime in the area. So as this continued, we did see that over the holidays, many families would just leave at once. I know that one of the accounts that we have is just that on a single day, over 50 families left from one of the bridges, right? So, but we continue to see them, some of them holding their ground, until unfortunately the city threatened essentially to charge them with child neglect, and the ones who were remaining were told to go to shelters, or they will be charged with that. So a lot of them either they had gone back to their home communities, or access through some other ports, and some of them did go back to the shelter. And those who have gone back to the shelters have now also been taken into a Mexican metering list that is being run by a state agency in Ciudad Juárez, and they have been processing in conjunction with CBP Mexican asylum seekers a little faster now, but we don't have these huge numbers, but it's a huge concern because those who we did see that went through, it just took a long time, and a lot of them were going through speedy procedures where they were just essentially turned back. So we saw the injustice there. And now as the numbers decline and we're seeing families being processed sooner, we're hopeful that those are going to be for a good outcome for them, but we're definitely disappointed and upset at how many people lost their opportunity to actually present their case. After that, we'll address some of what has come out more recently in terms of the agency DHS's response to the Red Team report and recommendations. And here there's not a lot to say. I think if you're someone who is familiar with what is happening, or you're an advocate, that if you read the report, the recommendations highlighted a lot of the concerns that advocates have been saying for a long time. People not having adequate access to information in their language, family separation. There were just concerns about how the due process, is actually being upheld, and how people were being notified or wrongfully notified with all these processes. It's telling, yet very disappointing, that the response for the agency is something that is just essentially denying or saying that they have taken these recommendations, but rather than responding to them in an adequate way, all they really do is list a series of activities that they're already doing. And if we can assume that they are in fact taking those measures, we know that they're also not really achieving the cause or fixing the problem, right? So it's ultimately, just a way of saying what they always say, we're doing our best, we're already providing interpreters and this and that, but we know that in fact that's not enough. And it has proven that it continues to be not enough as we continue to see people on the other side struggling and saying that they have been made to sign forms that are not in languages that they understand, that they have been separated from their families, that they have no information, that they don't have a tear sheet. So all the issues that are addressed that we have been saying, the agency's response is just to say, we're not doing anything wrong here, we're in compliance, and we're going to continue to do this. So in a way, it's kind of them saying that they don't really, there's no true accountability to what the community is saying and what the report, people in the report found. So that's also a major area of concern. But unfortunately, we know that many times that's how the agency tends to respond to this, which is not taking responsibility for what they're doing and saying that there's nothing wrong. Another major finding or major reason why we want to, to have this opportunity to share our findings for this year was through the Stanford Report. As I mentioned earlier, we were in collaboration with the Mills Legal Clinic, the Stanford Law School, and they focus on human rights and conflict resolution. And we had a group of three very, very bright law students. They were they came with their professor, and we put together a survey and a set of interviews. And through that, they were able to match it with their very thorough legal analysis. And it was in a way troubling, but also it was also a way for us to have a more deeper understanding of how many violations were happening and in how many categories that sometimes, we had not necessarily been thinking of it through that lens, but it was just shocking to see what they found. And through those interviews that we did and through the analysis, the most concerning ones is that Mexico is violating many of its human rights obligations, including the Convention Against Torture, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, along a couple of others. And the most shocking to me is also that it may be complicit Mexico, and I would also say the United States is complicit in enabling genocide through the collaboration of Remain in Mexico. We have seen this as we have documented from legal service providers, our staff at Hope Border Institute and a whole array of allies, that when you talk with migrants who are in this program, they have been subject to rapes, kidnaps, extortion. Many of them take place right outside the point where they're returned into Mexico, right as they're let go from CBP custody into INM custody or Grupo Beta and released into the streets. At that point, that street has been named time and time again as a place where migrants are just targeted, and people know that they can identify them. They know what they look like. They know that they have no shoelaces on, which is a sign that someone has been in detention in the US, where they take the shoelaces for security reasons. But then when they're returned, that's a very easy way to identify someone, with a plastic bag with their documents, no shoelaces coming out of that. So many of them have suffered that. Or have been victims of that sort of crime, in addition to violations by the National Guard, by local and federal police in Mexico that have also extorted many migrants, that have also detained many migrants wrongfully, that have also abused them. And so in doing so, in them really not having a lot of mobility, which is another of the findings, right? This limitation of freedom of mobility is a serious concern, because you're essentially creating this space where migrants are really stuck in this very dangerous parts of the city or even in the country, because again, the three states, or the states are all in the 5 high-level security threats according to the U.S. Travel Advisory. So you're placing them in those situations where they're just at higher risk of and more vulnerable because of their status and maybe some of their just themselves, sometimes what they look like, their accent, things like that, they can be preyed upon, essentially, right? So we know that there is essentially creating this hostage situation where you can't leave. We also have heard that sometimes people will say, well, they don't have to stay in those areas, they can leave. We know, in fact, that that's actually also not realistic. Many of them fear leaving, even their shelters. They fear, they don't know the place, they don't know the city, so their mobility is compromised. Also, just money-wise, they're stuck here for long periods of time. Many of them, if they can't work, it's like a cycle, right? If you can't work, if you can't travel, if you can't do this, you're essentially just basically being stuck in this place where people can prey on you. Just reiterating that. And at the end, when we kind of look back and say, okay, this is happening on the Mexican side, what is really happening on the American side, right, in terms of the agencies that are helping to perpetrate this situation? And one of the big numbers that they're usually talked about are the number of apprehensions, right, that CBP or Border Patrol have done. And what we have seen is that because there has been a series of acts, again, that have led up to the to now that have deterred people through cruelty, through violence, that numbers have in fact declined. At least from May of 2019 to December, we saw a 70% drop in apprehensions. We had also seen that up until now, the level of apprehensions around those months had been some of the highest, right? But we do know that not only have the actions of CBP and Border Patrol in conjunction with the Guardia Nacional in Mexico on its northern and southern border have deterred a lot of that migration path. People are being deterred, unfortunately. But what we have seen is that there's been an increase in apprehensions for family and children, right? So you're still seeing adults, single adults, but for the most part, and this has been a trend that has been going on for at least the last 2 years, that the people who are coming, the people that are being apprehended are families, right? Family with children, pregnant women that are coming here and that are not really hiding from CBP or Border Patrol. Many times, in fact, they present themselves to them. They go look for them. And, this facilitates the apprehension, but these are not people trying to run. They're trying to access their right to seek asylum. So what we see, this is like this increase in apprehensions in family units. The numbers have dropped though. But when you compare it to actually the appropriations or the budget for these agencies, we have seen the reverse. For the last, since 2003, we have seen this pretty big growth in terms of their budget size that doesn't really coincide with the level of apprehensions. Up until last year, where the apprehensions reached record numbers for the last decade, it still was contrary. It didn't really match up the level of funding that they were receiving with the level of apprehensions. And even within the level of apprehensions, again, what grew was the number of families and vulnerable populations. And so this mismatch with funding wasn't a surprise. They had been seeing this trend for years now leading up to this, yet they have been continued to be given a blank check to grow their budget, but not really address any of the needs of the people that are actually coming. They always talk about facilities, Border Patrol facilities, CBP facilities not being made, or they're not designed to hold families. And we agree, they're certainly not. I don't even think that they would be really worth, or people should never be detained in those types of conditions. But if they have been seeing this trend for the last 14 years, 10 years, and they had this massive budget increases, what was keeping them from actually acting on this change in demographic that they were seeing, right? So we know that this is not, it doesn't add up. And again, we've seen this now for 2020, we see an even bigger jump, so now the agencies have a budget of $25 billion. Again, we call for a need to increase their transparency and accountability to how they're using, their funding, and to use their funding more realistically to hire more asylum officers, people who are going to be able to process these claims more adequately rather than enforcement. And then lastly, we also see, again, just another wasteful allocation of resources in more wall funding. So now we have 18.2 in wall funding, and rather than wasting this money that is being used, just to create a physical barrier that is not only impacting our environment, it's impacting, the way that just natural migration of animals and wildlife. We also see its impact on water and obviously human lives, because the more that we have this, people do continue and just put themselves more at risk. And that wall, we have seen historically that the wall itself is not a deterrent. It hasn't been a deterrent for many years. and it just doesn't work. It just doesn't make any sense, right? We have seen the deterrence tactics that are violent and harmful have had an effect, but at the end of the day, we know that people continue to migrate because the true issues of why they're migrating are not being addressed. So until that happens, we have to modify things rather than just keep putting money into wasteful appropriations, like the wall and CBP enforcement. And you'll be able to see this in the report with more clarity. Yes, and again, sorry for not reminding you earlier, we're going to be taking questions in just a few minutes at the question section. So please continue to write your questions in our chat box, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. I think we're going to have plenty of time for questions. I'm excited about that. Okay, so now we ask you to take action, right? To take action today. Today is being recognized at the national level, marking the 1 year of MPP. And so there's several things that you can do, whether you're a policymaker or whether you're just an average citizen or actor in your community, you can do something. So we ask you to consider these 3 next options that we have. The first is to continue to support migrants' access to legal counsel. We encourage you to donate or to volunteer with a program called Estamos Unidos. That's through Clinic, one of our partner organizations. We are in desperate need of more people to come down here and provide information, provide full legal representation, or at least help in a lot of the Know Your Rights presentations that are taking place in Juárez. We can't stress enough how important it is for someone to have some access to this information. And as the program has developed, we have seen more and more ways that access to legal counsel and access to Know Your Rights presentation is being prohibited, or there's more barriers to it. And so we need more people on the ground. We need more people funding this type of project, because they can't do it alone. And presenting yourself in front of a judge without any knowledge about immigration law is really hard for anyone to do, much less someone who's coming and has gone through everything that they have gone through with the process to the border and then being sent back to Mexico after being fooled by that process of being in US custody and thinking that that's going to be their opportunity, and instead being told that they're going to be sent back and have their process go while they're in Mexico. So we ask you to please consider donating to Estamos Unidos. We're excited to have that project as one of our partner projects. We also ask you to be a part of the movement, stay in touch with our organization. We ask you to donate if you can to allow us to continue to do the work that we're doing. Stay engaged, obviously following our webinars, following our newsletters, following our new border dispatch, which we're very excited about. Consider, just becoming part of this movement with us. And then very importantly as well is that we ask you to contact your Congress today, or anytime, but especially today, and demand an end to remain in Mexico. And we ask you to also do so by supporting and asking them to express their support in the the Asylum Seeker Protection Act that is introduced by Veronica Escobar. And we strongly support any efforts that will ensure the end to remain in Mexico. And by defunding it, we think that this is a very big first step. And then I will go ahead and pass it over to Diego.
Yeah. So if you open your chat box today, for some reason, the chat.
No.
The chat box. Well.
Just 1 second. Bear with me. Sorry. Sorry. But how do I go back to the screen? Just go through. Okay, so we'll go ahead and go through your questions. We have one, as a Mexican living in the US with a green card, can I call Congress? I believe you can. Obviously, you have to be a US citizen to vote, but to take part in a call, I think that you can. Or you can also ask someone in your household who is a citizen to do so. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific about that, but I'll definitely take a look more deeply and get back to you in our email. Okay, I'll provide more detail on Estamos Unidos through the clinic program. So essentially, I've added the link. We'll also send that through our email, but it is a program that's funded through clinic. Currently, it has, it's a one-person staff, 1.5, they say, with our partner, Tania Guerrero, and she provides Know Your Rights trainings in Ciudad Juárez across the different shelters, and also takes in volunteers from across the country who come down and help through this. And hopefully the goal is to have people also who come down take on cases full rep, most likely pro bono, as they go back to their communities. And again, you can find more information on the link that's on the webinar, and we'll send it as soon as we're done with the webinar. Okay. How do people sign up for the Frontera Dispatch and the Frontera Fax? You can do so by going to our website, and there's a link there that can direct you to it. It is also part of the presentation, which we'll send afterwards. But if you just go to hopeborder.org, you'll be able to sign up for all of our newsletters and all of our material. But there's also a specific tab at the top banner that will guide you to the Frontera Dispatch sign-up sheet.
Our resources are they going to be on the website?
Yes, all of our resources are already live on our website. You can go again, visit hopeborder.org. You'll be able to find it under resources. You'll see Border Observatory Situational Report 2020. And it's probably also going to be on the landing page. Any other questions? Okay, just before we go, I would like to also highlight that one of the key things we wanted to cover in this report, again, you'll be able to go through both of them. Both of them, what makes them truly horrific in a way, like just of the findings, is because we center them, as we do most of our work, on human stories, right? We focus it on the human toll that these policies have had. So we have several stories that detail their journey, essentially, including that of a Cuban migrant woman who arrived at the port of entry, or arrived in Ciudad Juárez late in the summer, who was escaping, political persecution. Her family had a long history of political persecution. She presented herself at the port of entry after waiting for months because her health was just declining severely. And unfortunately, even though CBP acknowledged that she was sick, they ended up sending her back not only once, but twice. Initially, they asked for her back because of her health conditions. They recognized she had severe health conditions. Yet again, 2 days later, they sent her back and placed her in the Remain in Mexico program. Originally, she was metered. So after that, she was given a court date to February of this year. Unfortunately, this was in November. Unfortunately, this person died alone in Ciudad Juárez on December 6th. So again, these are some of the very true and tangible tragedies that take place. They will never be made better, unfortunately, but we can continue to try to make sure that they don't happen again. We also shared the story of survivors of human trafficking, women who have been sexually assaulted, whose kids have been sexually assaulted. So these are not just numbers that we're sharing with you. We're sharing true stories. We're sharing stories that have touched our lives for sure, and impacted the way that we do our work and the way that we can, we're inspired to fight. and we hope that they can do the same for you. And we ask you that you take these stories, and they're in the report. Take the facts for sure. You know, we wanted to make sure that you were up to date as to what was happening on the ground here in our community. But more importantly, take those stories and share them and let them sink in, right? That sometimes you have to sit with that discomfort before you get your phone and call Congress and let them know how wrong this is, and maybe even share one of the stories that you read in our report. I'm gonna just give a few more minutes if you have a question. Any more questions? No, okay. And so we'll be sharing our email with the webinar. We have the both of our reports are going to be released, and more information on the things that you can do. We also ask that you donate to the Estamos Unidos, to Hope, and also to the Bishop's Fund that helps the shelters in Juárez directly. Once again, I want to thank you all for your time and for joining me and Diego. And we'll keep up the good work. We hope that you do too. And stay tuned for our next webinar. Thank you.